So Lamennais says we need Catholic action, though without specifying it. He says we need the teaching authority of the Pope. And he, at this moment, in 1815, he says, our best hope of restoring Catholicism as France is with a strong monarch. He also says we need to stop looking at primitive Christianity through a traditionalist lens. Traditionalism here means no use of reason and just seeing primitive Christianity as something old that you either just live that way or you reject it. He says what we need to do is we need to look at the primitive revelation of the church and how the Christians lived it and how it was also developed over time so that we can start living it now again. We also need to look for excessive. We need to look for those pockets within the Catholic Church that provide energy, that provide life, that provide vitalism, that provide a possibility of a vision for the future. And hopefully the Pope will point those out and will give impetus to help to these movements or groups in the church. In 1815, he starts a congregation, the Congregation of St. Peter. And this congregation actually becomes very significant in the city of New York, in the development of the Catholic Church in the city of New York. He sends a number of his priests to New York City. By 1829, he starts to further refine his theories. And he actually starts to question this element of his theory. So he's a guy, obviously, his thought changes over time. Okay? But I think also you can see there are some things that he articulates early on in his life that actually get some of his... He has a lot of followers. He was a very prolific writer. His writings became extremely popular in the Catholic world of France. And there were some study circles that were specifically formed to read his writings and to try to implement them. Kind of like Communion and Liberation does with Giussani's writings. But it also, his thought changes over time, right? So by 1829, 1830, when the July Monarchy comes into place, he thinks through his position on monarchy and he says, actually, there's this question arises now, like, what is real freedom? And he starts to say in 1829, 1830, everywhere what the Catholic Church should do is the Catholic Church should ally itself with those movements that are pressing for revolutionary freedom. And the reason he says this is he says, look, the more you actually expand the electorate, the more the Catholics are just going to preserve the Catholic tradition. So we should be not violent. He's not talking about violence here. But he's saying, look, expansion of the liberals want there to be 1%. Right? When you actually look at all these revolutions and counter-revolutions, they're not about democracy. It's about, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It's basically about a new few wealthy elites who basically, they want to also sink their teeth into the carcass. Right? And they don't want to be whipped off by a sermon, whether they're liberal radicals, whether they're moderate liberals, or whether they're radical liberals. Because what's a moderate liberal? A moderate liberal is someone who wants 1% of the electorate to vote and call that a popular revolution. Well, what's a radical liberal? They want 2% to vote. And they want to call that, that's what they do in the July Monarchy. They expand the electorate to 2% so they can basically take out the king, right? And what are the moderate liberals and radical liberals fighting over? Whether the franchise should be 1% or 2%. It's during the July Monarchy that they start to make all these jokes in France about France Incorporated, France Inc. The idea being that France is just like a liberal corporation, and if you become wealthy enough, you can become part of the corporation. In the successor of Mao, what was his name? Deng in China? Deng Jinping. So basically, at one point in the 70s or 80s, he says, look, if you want to be part of the new ruling elite in China, get rich. And actually, he's actually plagiarizing from the 1830s in France. Because Guizot says, you want to be part of the franchise? You want to have a say in French politics? Get rich. Get rich, and then you can have a say. You'll be part of the electorate. $1, 1 vote. Right? Yes.
If I can be so bold as to ask a question drawing parallels to today, is that okay?
Sure.
Why is it? It seems.
If you haven't realized that already.
What I'm wondering is, it seems like now, maybe I'm reading things wrong. It seems like now, what we would call the radical movements want to expand the franchise, expand the vote to any number of people.
Yeah, to non-citizens.
That's
to 14-year-olds.
Right. That's a difference.
I think, yeah.
Them now and then. The moderates, however, are still kind of worried about that, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think so.
Sometimes.
I think so. I would agree.
Why do you think the radicals have changed since then?
Because, there also is this principle in politics that goes back to Aristotle, right? Aristotle says people that really want to change the Constitution, they're always trying to expand the franchise to people.
Who want to change it.
They always want to expand this franchise to people who are not part of it, promising them goods. In other words, promising them goods, and in exchange for those goods, they're going to vote for them.
Right. Is that one of the ways in which Marx sort of disrupts this tendency?
I think so, a little bit. Also Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, they changed this a little bit too. Because basically Martin Van Buren promises to Andrew Jackson, look, I think I know how to organize the Irish. Right? And I think if you stick with me, I can deliver the Irish vote for you. And so if we can expand the franchise to the Irish, let them vote, I guarantee you'll become president. Which is a variation, obviously, from this.
Non-citizens.
At that time, yeah, the Irish were. But you got to remember, the Irish were. We have these. It's interesting to just think about this little point, right? Like sometimes we'll have like Slumdog Millionaire, that movie, about the wretched conditions in Delhi. And the Irish in New York had a greater population density and lived in much worse conditions than what you see in Slumdog Millionaire.
In Durham.
Pardon?
In Durham. That's crazy.
Yeah. So they were, and so to be in New York City in these little shacks, but the population density of the Irish Catholics in New York, and in New York as an example of many cities in the 1820s and 30s, was worse than what's now in Delhi. Right. So when Martin Van Buren is basically saying, "I'm going to deliver you the Irish," he also is trying to organize them to give them. Thomas Jefferson would say stuff like, "Look, hire Irish people to work in the swamps. And don't have your slaves work in the swamps, because if a slave dies, you got to pay for his burial, right? But if an Irish worker dies, you don't got to pay for his burial. You can just let him rot in the swamp." So in a way, the Irish were less than slaves in this country. They were kind of like demi-human. Yes.
Going back to Joe's question, have liberals been consistent over the years have they made a consistent shift in the first?
I don't think so. I think liberals are very pragmatic.
Oh, yeah.
I think they're very pragmatic. I think we'll see this as time goes on.
Because in this case, if they expand the electorate, they'll go for the monarchy.
Right. So De Lamennais says basically, by 1830, he says we should not be afraid of liberty or freedom. We should basically realize that the monarchy has a tendency really to side with the liberals. And it has a tendency to put religion in second place. We should encourage revolt, because revolt actually will lead to the freedom of the church. So between 1830 and 1850, there's a lot. I heard a historian once say this. The time 1830 to 1850 in Europe is very similar of the time 1958 to the present, as far as debates within the church about freedom. Because there's a lot of questions that arise in the 1830s where people are saying, well, maybe we should just embrace democratic freedom everywhere. And for example, in Ireland, Lamennais is very ennobled. He's very he's very much enthused by the example of Daniel O'Connell and the Irish movement within Ireland to basically try to push for Irish union, to come up with a parliament, and basically to use democratic action to kick the British out and to run Ireland as its own country. There's this one Catholic leader in Ireland, Daniel O'Connell, who's kind of promoting kind of a unified Catholic movement for freedom, for democratic freedom. And within the Irish context, it kind of makes sense. So a number of revolutions happen in the 1830s that make people kind of start to ask this, make Catholics and non-Catholics all, start to think about, well, maybe we should side with even the democratic naturalist vision of freedom.
So Lamennais.
Yeah, is that coming from Lamennais?
Yeah, this is coming now from Lamennais.
But didn't he 15 years earlier he said that's precisely
Right, so he's kind of going back on his support for the monarchy from 1815. He's changed. This is one of the changes in his thought. Now it's the July. The first thing is the July monarchy is the movement that leads to the July monarchy is kind of one of the things that leads Lamennais to say, well, maybe we should just embrace democratic freedom. And another revolution, actually, my professor of diplomatic history at Marquette in the 1990s, in the previous millennium, I know it's old, but he actually won all sorts of awards in Belgium and France for his research, but he was completely unrecognized in the United States. He's a really fascinating guy. He converted to he was from a Southern Georgian family, and he converted to Catholicism. And his father, to punish him in the will, left him in charge of all of the manufacturing plants that the family owned. He's from a very wealthy family. But this guy the reason his father did this is he loved history. And he went to the Louvain to become a historian. He was kind of a genius. And so what he did is he hired basically a guy to run all, and in his family, in Southern culture, if the father leaves it in the will that you are the guy that runs the factories, you got to do it. You can't kind of say no. All right. So, but what he did is he hired someone to run all the factories, and then he took the money that was his part of the family inheritance to basically pay for his education in Louvain. He became a history professor, and he converted to Catholicism, went to Marquette, and actually at Marquette he went to work and became a cooperator. And he would write his own history textbooks and just self-publish them and then give them to the students. So I took 6 or 7 classes from this guy. But he won an award in France for unearthing in an archive. He unearthed in an archive the letters going back and forth between Napoleon and his brother in France in the days leading up to Waterloo. That Napoleon was trying to get some troops, 20,000 troops from Spain up to Waterloo that would be his reserves for the battle. And if he could have delayed Waterloo probably just another 2 or 3 days, he would have had enough troops probably in reserve to win the Battle of Waterloo.
Wow.
And he won the highest honor in France that you can win for the paper that he wrote based on that research that he found. And he found it in an archive in Belgium. Because his major work in life, he did research on all the revolutions in the 19th century in Europe. And he basically unearthed that the only revolution in 19th century Europe that was truly democratic was the Belgian Revolution of the 1930s. The 1830s. And this is what happened in that revolution. So basically, I think in this time, the Netherlands had a kind of... they were kind of the overseers of Belgium. And the Netherlands were basically trying to impose a kind of British Enlightenment model of government, which was anti-clerical, on the Belgian people. But they were also trying to kind of suppress any form of radical thought. So basically what happened in Belgium is that the Catholics got together with the radicals and they said, let's have a revolt. It wasn't a violent revolt. But basically, let's have a revolt, let's protest, and let's basically kick the Dutch out. And let's have democratic rule with separation of church and state, meaning the church is free to set up her own schools, her own university, and run her affairs without interference from the state. No regalist, no like monarchist, regalist policies. And I think they even said, okay, we can have a constitutional monarchy and you can have a Protestant king. But the king has nothing to do with the church. And the Concordat was that they ended up signing after this revolt was that basically the Catholics could run their own schools and they could appoint their own bishops. So the first Catholic bishops' conference was Belgium in the 1830s. And in the 1830s, after this revolt, they set up the Louvain University, the Catholic University of Belgium. And they set up an entire Catholic private school system of primary schools and high schools. And I would say the only big mistake they made is the Catholics basically said, we don't really care too much about the Republic of Letters. And we'll let the radicals kind of have their way in the Republic of Letters. And they also, they said basically, we don't care about if the king and his court wants to develop some sort of imperial policy and take over a country in Africa like Congo or something like that, right? Because, later on in the 19th century, that's what happens. And the Catholics basically just say, well, if the government's there, we can send in missionaries and try to counterbalance whatever bad things the government does. So, and we'll say something about the separation of church and state in Belgium in a few minutes when we get to Lamennais. So, but basically in that revolt in the 1830s, Lamennais and many people see it as well, this is interesting, right? It's a truly democratic revolt. The franchise gets expanded. The Catholics basically vote for freedom of the church. The Pope now can actually appoint the bishops. The Catholics can set up their own schools, which they can't do in France or pretty much any other European country. And so the church actually has room to breathe. So that's interesting. So there's a question. There's no definitive answers at this point. But there's a question that arises. Well, maybe this thing of separation of church and state isn't so bad. And then the third thing that happens in the 1830s is the Polish Revolution against Russia. Poland in the 1790s no longer exists as a state. Most of it's run by Russia, but it's also run in part by Prussia and by Austria. And in the 1830s, the Polish aristocrats revolt against the Russians. Now, at this time, it's important to remember, at this time, most Polish aristocrats were flaming naturalists. Okay, they were followers of John Locke. They loved the American Revolution. In fact, at one point, the Polish bishops have a meeting, and they decide an entire generation has been lost to the Enlightenment in the 1830s, in the late 1830s. All of our leaders, they could care less about the church. So they commit, and then they say that's probably why we've lost our nation, is that we've had too many leaders for too long that haven't thought about things as Catholics. So they decide at that point, the Polish bishops decide in the late 1830s, what we need to do is the only thing we can really do is we just need to insist that we have to be given the freedom to rebuild an entire educational structure from kindergarten to the university structure in which we can teach, along with everything else, we can teach Catholicism. And if we do that, at some point, we'll get our nation back. Right? And so that's what they do. And what comes out of that system, I think, eventually is Henryk Sienkiewicz, who writes the novels. He writes these great novels in which he's basically saying these novels are going to enable the reconstitution of Poland. And then out of that also you get, in the early 20th century and throughout the entire 20th century, this whole class of educated Poles who are Catholic and also pretty smart, that basically eventually, give us Legutko, whatever his book is on democracy. The demon of democracy. But in the 1830s, the Polish revolt is kind of
And also the Pope.
and also Pope, Karol Wojtyła. Also in the 1830s, the Polish revolt is an Enlightenment revolt against the Russians. And like the Catholics in France and in the entire Catholic world, they're wondering, should we support the Poles or not? Because, the Polish nation is Catholic, but then they say, but the leaders are Enlightenment. And some people say, but if you support the revolt and Poland actually becomes a democracy, the good people of Poland will probably, in the end, they'll probably make sure that it's more or less a Catholic country. All right, so there's kind of a question that gets raised during this time. Lamennais opens a journal called L'Avenir, the future.
This is in 30?
In the 30s, yeah. L'Avenir, the future. It's still a paper that continues to exist this day in France. It's a Catholic paper to this day. But at this point in the 1830s, it's dedicated to promoting the idea that maybe the real way to bring about revolutionary freedom and the freedom of the church and the return to order is actually through promoting real democracy. Promoting, and Lamennais in this art in this magazine also says, maybe this is the real way to get vitalistic movements, to get energetic movements, to really critique the deficiencies of the Enlightenment, to not fall into any kind of traditionalism. And by the late 1830s, I think it's 1836, there's a lot of concern about Lamennais' ideas, both within France and outside of France. And so Lamennais decides at one point to make the pilgrimage of liberty to Rome. And he wants to go to Rome, and he wants basically to get Gregory XVI, who's the Pope, to basically say the editorial policy of L'Avenir is the way to go. And I would say in a way Lamennais was, popes don't like to do this, right? Just in general, and throughout the history of the papacy. Popes in general like to kind of let things develop, and if things develop well, then they sanction it in some way, but they usually try to sanction it without saying, they also never want to say, everybody has to do this. Why? Because there's a diversity of institutions and spirits in the church, right? And the Pope is there to harmonize them all. And Lamennais was kind of one of these characters that unless he was affirmed by everybody, he would easily think that it was a tragedy. He had kind of a strong temperament in that sense. So they spend the whole summer, I think it was 1836, kind of politicking the Pope. And eventually the Pope, Gregory XVI, he comes out with Mirari Vos. It's a famous papal document in which he basically says, he doesn't directly criticize Lamennais, but he says we got to be cautious about promoting separation of church and state. Now, historians to this day will call Gregory XVI black reaction, reactionary, counter-revolutionary, terrible Pope, because he critiques separation of church and state, the way Lamennais is promoting it. Okay? But you got to remember, at the same time that Gregory XVI critiques Lamennais, at this point, he's working with Belgium. Right? He's working with the Belgians. Because their separation of church and state is different. It's not Lamennais, saying we got to support democratic revolt and separation of church and state everywhere. Lamennais kind of refuses to accept Mirari Vos, and he tries to press the Pope further to support his ideas. And so then, in a second document, which I forgot to write down the name of it, the Pope actually directly critiques the ideas of Lamennais.
Is there a different terminology that is used between the good separation of church and state and then the...
Nope, and not at this point.
Because it's such, but even, I mean, today,
Not to this day, no.
because it's so confusing, you know.
I know. Yep,
Discussions.
I know. Well, we're in a time very similar to the 1830s on this point. So in this document, Gregory says basically, look, you can't have just all-out freedom, right? You got to make some distinctions. You can't just have like blanket acceptance of every version of freedom that's out there, right? You got to be careful about promoting individualism, a freedom that just promotes individualism. And so if you have freedom that's kind of loosely defined and individualism with separation of church and state, you basically are looking at a prophet who's trying to announce too much. That's what he says about Lamennais. And this causes Lamennais to go into a spiritual tailspin, which results in him leaving I think by this point he was a priest. It results in him leaving the priesthood and leaving the church. Right? He had difficulty accepting this correction. Now, if we can I want to turn briefly now after he kind of before he goes into like his full tailspin and he leaves the church, he and his followers will continue to support basically some kind of confection of ideas of like, we need freedom, we need God, and we need social justice. Right? But there's always a question, right? There's a question that goes back to the 18th century. Should we coddle up to the promoters of Enlightenment freedom? Should we accept the Lockean notion of freedom, which is based on a limited idea of the human person? Should we accept the Lockean notion of the absolute right to private property? Because it seems that especially during the liberal monarchy, the July monarchy, and in England and wherever it gets promoted, that the absolute right to private property, the only thing it does is it enriches the few, the business class. Checks and balances seem to work in the favor of those who have the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal, to really influence the system. A lot of times it seems what's happened in the experience of Europe is that the executive, the monarch, was oftentimes the only one that looked after the poor. And as we limit the power of the monarchies, what tends to happen is the power of bankers or the business class tends to increase. And it tends to actually overtake, in the name of freedom, what actually ends up happening is it's freedom for the business class and misery for everybody else. And the business class can basically support and finance the journalists, the theater, and they can pull the purse strings tight so that public relations, journalism, education basically just follow the dictates and the common sense of the business class. And the business class basically could care less about religion. They're like Constantine, right? What does it matter to me? The arcane debates of theologians, right? I just want to go on with the business of empire, right? So religion and the religious disputes, they're of secondary importance. If in a good system, they're neutralized or controlled. And in France, this was debated among the Catholics. Look, a lot of times, the freedom of religion in the United States and Great Britain, it's a little bit hypocritical. Because why? It's a freedom, and it seems like in Britain and the United States, it's a freedom that's basically the multiplication, it's pluralism. It's the multiplication of sex with kind of a relativistic outcome. It's a multiplication of sects so as to neutralize religion, to get religious bodies to to engage in combat against each other, in which really there's no one truth. And so it's a formula for long-term relativism. Pluralism, understood in this way, is a formula for long-term relativism in a society. It seems that more and more what's happening in Spain and Europe, they start to understand, France, Germany, and Italy, is that the liberals, they're not giving freedom to the church. It's easy to give freedom to the church in the United States and Great Britain, because in the United States, the Catholics are an insignificant minority. In Great Britain, they hardly exist. But everywhere else, what happens is that what liberalism does is that it basically, if it grants a kind of freedom, it's very limited. The church is subservient to the state. The control's still the appointment of bishops. The bishops become flatterers of the regime. And over time, if it's a moderate regime, it chips away at the institutions of the church. It corrodes the morals of the people. They don't let freedom really take place because they want to engage in they want to engage in a kind of culture war against the church. And when the radicals get control, they basically break out into violence against the church. They kick out the religious orders, and they basically want there to be no public manifestations of the church. So they don't really grant any freedom to the church. So it's not easy to take there's no clear answer at this point. Yes.
But is there inevitability to this trend? I mean, it seems like if Catholics are trying to counteract this natural inclination of the state, couldn't it be stopped without simply saying, oh, this kind of political arrangement necessarily leads to relativism and or radical violence down the road? You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense, the question? So,
I guess hypothetically, you just have to see. I mean, there's no real experience. There's no real experiment at this.
right.
At this point. I think what happens in the United States is that, I think really what happens, there's this exchange of letters between Adams and Jefferson in the 1820s, which I think is fairly instructive. Because Jefferson gets Adams to come over to the side that, at one point in one of his letters, Jefferson says, look, he's writing to Adams, he says, look, every 20 years, we need a revolt. And there won't be freedom until rivers of blood flow throughout Europe. Right? Because Adams is really worried about Europe, right? And after Jefferson writes that, Adams doesn't oppose it. He says, yeah, I guess you're right. Right? He's not happy with it, but he also doesn't oppose it. Right? And then in another letter, Adams basically says, they're debating about the question of Irish immigration in the United States. And Adams just says to Jefferson, he says, Jefferson kind of is on the side of, in this correspondence of, probably we should limit Irish immigration, right? Because the Irish will ruin this country, right? And the response of Adams is, Adams, I think on this point is at least somewhat consistent. He says, Adams for like his bedtime reading, like to rejuvenate his good spirits, right? He would read books that basically trash the Jesuits, right? That's one of the things that he did to kind of because he really hated the Jesuits like everybody at his time, it seems. And he, in one of his last letters to Jefferson, he says, look, I'm a deist, I'm a revolutionary, I'm an Aryan, right? And that's, I think, the future. And he says, I think the Irish are going to completely ruin. If we let the Irish into this country and they become a majority, they would completely ruin this country. It would be the end of our civilization. But then the last line of the letter is, but I think according to our principles, we'd have to let them do it.
It's just the same.
Why are they so close to their popery?
Because they're despots, popish, priestcraft. They believe in they believe in the Trinity. They believe in the Trinity, and they think the Trinity is like
It's not another
mystical, wishful thinking, you know, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, Adams is basically a Lockean.
It's not like a matter of grace. It's not like a matter of grace. It's a matter of theology.
What?
That they just like the Irish.
Well, I think it's, you know, I think it's a mixture.
Together.
I think it's a mixture. I mean, there's not actually at this point. There's not a whole lot of racial thinking that's kind of explicit. It doesn't happen until the middle of the 19th century.
Okay.
So, because of the various, I just want to take. I'm just going to take a little step away from Lamennais for a second here. Because of the various political movements in Europe, a lot of times even the moderate liberals, they are all for passing laws when they get control to prevent like more radical liberal movements from breaking out. And also, of course, like in Charles X, when people like Charles X are in power, there's always a crackdown on radical liberals. So what starts to happen in Plato's Republic, you remember I said, if there's no justice, we should set up democratic forms of government and then rule from behind the scenes, right? The opening of Book 2 of the Republic. Well, you also start to see in the 1830s the emergence. Some of these societies they're given birth to before the 1830s, but in the 1830s they start to show their public effects. I mean, just as the Catholic study circles start to mature and show some fruit, well, also the radicals also have their secret societies. And there's this idea, I think it comes from Rousseau, but there is this idea, a little bit also from the experience of the radicals during the monarchy of Charles X, that they come to see, like, we have a problem, right? They start to understand, we have a problem. If we just open up the democratic vote, we're going to lose. Because so often we open up the vote to when we expand the electorate to like 10%, everybody votes for the king, right? Or you let people vote in Italy and they all vote for the Pope, right? So you gotta kind of you gotta do something about this. And this is the formation of secret societies. And there's a lot of thought given in the 1830s to. We have to manipulate public opinion for the breakthrough moment. And the idea here is the breakthrough moment, right? The breakthrough moment is that we have to kind of start coming up with ways of manipulating culture, the singing clubs, the opera, music. We want to try to create public opinion so that when you have a vote, you have kind of a breakthrough moment. You have a moment where you've so engineered opinion, at least among enough people that are voting, that they basically side with the radical revolution. They side with the Enlightenment, even if it's just for one vote, right? But that's your breakthrough moment, right? And so there's this whole theory that starts to develop about how do you engineer society so as to create the breakthrough moment. Yes.
Who's saying this?
These are the naturalists, both moderate and radical. And actually, they think through not just the political institutions. So, for example, you start to see in the 1830s in opera these figures that start to write Verdi's operas. Some of them, like one of Verdi's operas, Nabucco, is very much like this. Like the opera kind of culminates in what's a breakthrough moment for freedom. Right? And because the idea is like once you can produce this breakthrough moment, people will feel free and they'll embrace freedom. Or whatever is defined as freedom in that moment. Dance, they start to try to influence dance during these times as well. Various dance movements. In Catalonia is the first, you start to see some of the first dance movements to try to produce the breakthrough moment, so that through dance you can have the expression of freedom so they can break away from Spain. Right?
No dance.
Chopin, and I didn't write down the Sardones?
Oh, La Sardaña.
La Sardonia.
Yeah.
That was from the 1830s to try to produce the breakthrough moment. Verdi's operas, Nabucco, Chopin, as we say in the United States, or Chopin. He was a big promoter of the Enlightenment, and he would sometimes go on tour hoping that his music would kind of bring about a breakthrough moment. I think later on in 1848, you see this with Nietzsche, and you can see this kind of in the relationship between Nietzsche and Wagner. Nietzsche becomes a big philosopher of the will to power, trying to get rid of Socrates and the influence. I mean, Nietzsche does he tries to do De Maistre one better, right? He says the real problem is many thousands of years ago, Socrates got Western civilization committed to pursuing the truth. And Jesus Christ got Western civilization committed to pursuing the proposition that we should treat women with the same love with which we treat the celestial virgin, right? I was giving a lecture once on this at the lakes at Notre Dame. It was pretty funny, actually, because I'm at the lake at Notre Dame, and I kind of thought, this would be a nice place to give the lecture on how, Mary's the celestial virgin. And Nietzsche is basically saying we have to come up with a moment where we can reject love for the celestial virgin and we can return to the relationships between men and women, which I'm going to define as the war between the sexes, right? Which became a television show in the 1970s, and I think a movie 2 or 3 years ago. And then he says, and if this happens, men and women will return to that relationship which exists between the animals. It'll be an expression of love, will be an expression of animal bestiality, right? So I was giving this lecture at Notre Dame on the lake next to the grotto, and so I was able to point to the celestial virgin, and then I literally got to the moment of men and women will treat each other like beasts, the love will become animal bestiality, and right at that moment behind me on the lake, this male duck started trying to drown the female duck. And it's one of those great moments in teaching, where nature herself provides the graphic example, and all the girls were completely horrified. Oh! So Hugo wrote a novel, The Hernani, in the 1830s. Dedicated to trying to show how to bring about this breakthrough moment. This is also in the 1830s where they started to theorize the importance of demonstrations. Right? If you have a demonstration, and if you organize the demonstration properly, there will be a spirit that descends on the demonstration. And if you have a properly written manifesto, and you sing the right songs during the demonstration, you'll produce the breakthrough moment. So you get a lot of in the 1830s in France, you'll get a lot of radicals especially who believe in this idea of the breakthrough moment, and they will try to get little revolutions going, like student revolts going against even the July monarchy. So, for example, one little revolt that starts against even the liberal monarchy is in 1832. The occasion of this revolt is the funeral of Lamarck. You got it. That's the actual setting of Les Miserables, right? The funeral of Lamarck, and the idea was that they wanted to use the occasion of the funeral of Lamarck to get a bunch of student riots going in Paris to protest the way that workers in Lyon Grenoble were being treated, right? And which we'll hopefully explain a little bit more later. But also,
Grenoble, the same place where.
Yeah. I mean, the workers in Grenoble are always getting trashed. It's like if you want to be a worker and get trashed in the 18th and 19th century, go to Grenoble. So, also, to properly produce these breakthrough moments, they started very much getting into this idea that when you go to these breakthrough moments, you have to have flags, and these flags have to have colors, but no heraldry, no symbols, because colors are more natural. And so it's what's more natural will enable kind of a festival that will bring out a breakthrough moment that will produce a more fraternal world.
Rousseauian.
It's very, very Rousseauian. And also, once you have these breakthrough moments, if in the secret societies, you can write constitutions that can then be promulgated during these breakthrough moments. These new constitutions for society. So we'll stop there.